So quite literally 40% of the people, if this tax code actually gets put through in the way that he proposed it, 40% of people would see a decrease in their take-home pay. All right, everybody, welcome back. Welcome back to another day in my life where we get to talk about my favorite thing in the whole world, taxes. Oh, yeah, that's right. So Trump won. We know that now. I called it. I have it in writing. None of you are going to believe me. It doesn't matter. I predicted 300 electoral votes. He got 312. You know why I said he was going to win? Because his message was simpler. It wasn't necessarily better. It wasn't necessarily more impactful. It was just simpler, okay? That's the only reason. When you think about her message, it was death to democracy. This is the end. People don't understand what that means, death to democracy. They don't even know what a democracy is. His message was eggs are too expensive. Which one do you think people understood? People gravitate toward things they understand. That's why he won. And what's really interesting is that if you actually look at his tax proposals, because that was a huge component of this campaign, we have an expiring tax code. It's going to sunset after the end of 2025. So whoever was going to be elected here had to deal with it. That was a big part of this. So he campaigned a lot on these tax cuts. And guess what? If you look at their tax proposals, you look at Harris, you look at Trump. His wasn't necessarily better for the average person, but it was way more understandable. So guess what? They voted for him, and they voted for him a lot. So today, what we're going to do is we're just going to look at some of these promises he made, and we're going to decide, okay, are these probable, plausible, or not going to happen? It's pretty easy to measure when you actually look at the proposals what's possible and what's really kind of just way out there and completely talk. Okay. So, let me start with this. I said in the beginning that his message was just simpler. It was easier to understand. And it's very evident when you look at these tax proposals that that was the case because, like I said, they're not necessarily better. Now, you and I can understand this concept because here's the deal. If you're listening to a podcast, like in general, listening to a podcast, that basically means you're trying to educate yourself. Like that's the whole point. If you're trying to educate yourself, that means you're trying to put yourself at least in, let's just say the top half of like the IQ range, 51 to 100, let's say. You may not even be there, but let's just pretend like you're trying to be there. Well, on average, we know that most people spend most of their time with people who are similar to them. So if you're in the top half of the IQ range because you're listening to this, that means you spend most of your time with other people who are in the top half of the IQ range. That means you are exposed primarily to people who are in the IQ range of 51 to 100. That means that you think the average person's IQ is 75. If all you do is spend your time with people between 51 and 100, the average IQ to you is 75. What you can't actually fathom is the fact that the average IQ of the average person in this country, the 50th percentile, is way dumber than the people that you spend any time around. I just want to get that out of the way right now. So you can't possibly fathom how dumb the average person is in this country. Just telling you. Not everybody makes choices that are in their own best interest. I don't know how to prove this to you, or I don't have any stats that show this, but if you just go and simply look at voting numbers, like so many people vote on voting day, like most people. And I have to imagine that there is a measurable percentage of the electorate that literally doesn't know you can vote early. I don't have another explanation. There has to be a measurable, it's a non-zero number. It's a non-zero number of people that literally don't know you can vote early. So just let that sink into your brain. Maybe I made that up, but I kind of think it's true. I really do. Look at the lines. So another thing, all I'm going to do is talk about income tax. I'm not going to talk about tariffs. I'm just not. We can do that maybe next time. I understand income tax, so we're going to stick to that. The next thing, when you think about the way that Trump speaks to people, like we've all seen him interviewed, right? He went on the podcast tour this year. he repeats himself over and over and over and over again. Why do you think he does that? He calls it the weave. Why does he always say the same thing over and over and over? It's because he wants to make sure you know exactly what he's saying. So he says it over and over and over again. He keeps it simple. People can actually hear this stuff. You know, if you look at Kamala, part of the problem with her income tax proposal is that it had a really heavy emphasis on credits. Okay. Child tax credit, green energy credit, this, that. I'm sorry to break it to you, but once you start getting into credits and percentages, you completely lose the average person. They have no idea what you're talking about, because for somebody to actually be able to quantify the value of a tax credit to them, they need to actually be able to understand what their tax liability is. They need to be able to actually understand what the marginal impact of that tax credit is, and to be able to make a true value judgment on how valuable that is to them. Nobody's doing that. But if I say no tax on tips, well, people understand that. They might not be able to tell you if it's valuable to them or not, but they can actually understand that. Why do you think Kamala stole that line? I mean, it's pretty obvious. Anyway, yeah, the second you start talking percentages, people lose their mind. And what's crazy, like I said before, is that this messaging worked. I'm not going to say he fooled a bunch of people, because, well, I don't know. Sometimes I think that these guys don't even understand their own tax policies or their own tax proposals. Maybe that's a different discussion. So I pulled a bunch of stuff from this website, thetaxfoundation.org. So when you get really bored and you can't sleep at night, that's what everybody's going to do. They're going to go to taxfoundation.org, and they're going to look at Donald Trump's tax plan ideas, details, and analysis. There's a very deep write-up they did on this, on a bunch of these different proposals that he made. Most of it we won't get into, because quite honestly, it's so niche and has such a minute impact that we can't deal with it. So I'm going to just try and deal with the things that were kind of publicly announced, broadly announced. So we'll look at no tax on tips, no tax on overtime. He's kind of floated around reducing the SALT cap reduction. What is that? Making auto loans deductible. So there's a few interesting pieces. Social Security's in there as well. But let's start with this. No tax on tips. Now, as a proposal itself, it has a pretty small impact. It actually has much more of a, I would say, a popular impact. Like it's easy to communicate in pop culture. Many people have worked in a tipped job, so they kind of understand this. Certainly, if you've worked in a tipped job before and you follow the rules, you know what it's like to get a tip and actually have to log it in the system, make sure that it goes through the payroll, that the employer can withhold whatever they need to withhold, record it. People kind of get that. The reality is this is per the stuff that I could Google, let's say. My quick Google search says there's only 4 million people who are actually tipped workers in this country. I think an important thing to do also is to make sure that we define what a tip is, at least per the IRS. Okay. A tip is a discretionary, which means optional or extra, discretionary payment determined by a customer that employees receive from that customer. It's distinct from wages or a bonus. So if you've ever worked in a tipped job, you would actually see a box for tipped wages on your W-2. These are distinct line items. So the plumbing is in place, per se, to be able to exempt this from income tax. The problem with this, and the problem with exempting overtime from income tax, is that it's very easily gamified, if you will. So a big reason that there is a lot of support for something like this actually has nothing to do with even the tipped workers, though it's a larger number of people. It has to do with the fact that your employers, when they record your tip payments, have to pay payroll tax. They have to pay payroll tax on all of your tips. So, very simple illustration, right? If you get a $10 tip and you actually record that, your employer despite having not paid you any of that money, is literally going to pay, depending on where you are, 7 or 8, I guess in $10, 70 or 80 cents of payroll tax. Actually, probably closer to $1 of payroll tax just because you got tipped. So there's a lot of restaurant owners or other facilities where they actually employ tipped workers who are in favor of that, because that's literally just a tax that has nothing to do with their business, has nothing to do with them selling more product. It's literally a customer tipping an employee creates a tax for the business owner. So they're big fans of it. The reason I think this is plausible is that there's only 4 million people who are tipped workers in the United States. That is way less than the number of people who are taking Social Security. Like, he's talked about making Social Security tax free, and I think that's also plausible. But there's 70 million people who are on Social Security right now taking Social Security benefits today. 70 million. We're talking about 4 million tipped workers in the United States. It is a fraction of the number of people. If you were to look at wages, the average tipped worker is making about $32,000 a year. That's just over $15 all in. So when you think about this, if I was to just run very simple math, if somebody's making $32,000, they get a standard deduction of, call it 12 to keep the math easy. That gives you $20,000 of taxable income as a single person. That's something like $2,200 of tax that they would have paid that they otherwise don't have to, because of potentially tax-free tips. Now, there's going to be ways that this is going to be gamified. This will absolutely be abused if it's put into place. And there's probably going to be a higher burden on record keeping and audits in order to make sure that this doesn't get abused. So there might not really be, I mean, this could be a pretty meaningful net cost for that type of stuff to actually be put in place. They're probably going to have to levy pretty severe penalties to people who abuse this type of system. I bet you a lot of restaurants will shift to something like an opt-out system, which technically keeps it optional, but it might be, let's say that they take food prices from $10 before tip. So if I go to a restaurant, typically I pay $10 for a meal and I might pay 20%, $2 for the tip. That's an all-in $12 cost. They might say, well, actually, we're going to decrease food costs by, 20%. So call it $8 for the meal, but then put a mandatory 50% tip on there, or default you into a 50% tip. Gets me to the same $12 spot all in as the end consumer. But then basically all of the employees' wages are tax-free. The employer would actually save 10% because they don't have to pay that payroll tax anymore on those tips they otherwise would have paid. In that type of scenario, everybody wins. But it really comes down to, how are they going to define tips? What are they going to allow on this? So plausible, but there's a lot of work. The implementation here is tricky. Same thing with overtime, right? Overtime, if you look at some of these numbers from the Tax Foundation, basically it is saying that overtime is going to have if we were to exempt overtime from income tax, it would have a meaningfully higher, like 6 or 7 times higher net decrease in tax revenue to the government if they were to exempt overtime. I have to think that that's understated, because whenever these tax projections are done, they're just taking current collections, looking at how this country operates today and saying, if nothing changes, here's what these tax proposals are going to do. The reality is people change their behaviors around the rules all the time. So, if I was a business owner and I wanted to exempt I wanted to get my employees more money, I would pay them more overtime, or I'd figure out a way to get them to pay more overtime. Maybe there's going to be some rules about making sure that employees still have to pay into Social Security, or employers still have to pay payroll tax on overtime or tips. I could see that, but exempting it entirely from federal income tax. This doesn't necessarily mean that states aren't still going to tax these lines of income. So again, there's a bunch of devils in the detail as far as how this stuff's actually going to get implemented, but tips is more likely than overtime. I understand the premise here, but I'd say it's much more likely that tips are tax-free than overtime being tax-free, if for no other reason, quite honestly. Then if you think about it, if I tip somebody, I'm giving them my after-tax money, right? I made income, I paid tax on my income, and then I gave that income to somebody else in the form of a tip. I don't get a deduction for paying them. So that's technically double tax. Does anybody think about that? I don't know. Double tax is kind of messed up if you think about it. So removing the tax on tips, sure, plausible. Overtime, that's going to be way trickier. That's way easier to gamify. Almost anybody can just be signed up for overtime. That impacts way more people. Probably not there. Here's the other one to think about. Social Security. So he's talked a lot about taking Social Security and making it tax-free. Why did he do that? Well, it's pretty simple. 70 million people are on Social Security benefits. You know how many votes he got? Like a little bit over 70 million. If you can just win that demographic, you're going to win. And here's the thing that people don't realize today about Social Security is that sometimes it is tax-free. Actually, in many cases, it is tax-free. So depending on how many other income sources you have, Social Security is either 0% taxed, either half of it is taxed, 10% of it is taxed. This isn't saying that it's an 85% tax rate. It's to say that you take 85% of the benefit that you made that year, and that amount you pay income tax on. The thing with this is that 40% of the people who are retired in this country live only on Social Security. Okay? And of those people, I would say that virtually all of them are already getting Social Security tax-free. They might not realize that though, okay? I'm going to say it. Like, they might be getting Social Security that's already tax-free, and they might not realize it. For the other people who are paying tax on half their Social Security or paying tax already on most of their Social Security, if you're in those buckets, many cases you have other income sources. Social Security is not your main source of income. This is going to have a much more muted effect to you overall. This is also doable, I would say, if for no other reason than the fact that literally almost half of the people who are getting Social Security already are getting it tax-free. But in some ways, honestly, this is a brilliant move. Like, the fact that he's telling people who are getting Social Security and are not paying tax on their Social Security, and he's rebranding it as, hey, let's make Social Security tax-free, is like totally brilliant. Hey, you're getting this benefit already? You don't know about it? Let me make sure you know about it. And now he just won their vote. Pretty brilliant. Let's see. Social Security, on average, the benefit for people who are claiming it today, it's about $1,780 a month. It's about $21,000 a year. So $21,000 a year. Half the people who are taking it aren't even paying taxes. It's doable. It's doable. Some of this other stuff he might not do. I'll give you one that he's not going to do, is the SALT cap elimination. So SALT, S-A-L-T, state and local tax cap. What this means is if you pay local taxes at all, so there's 43 states where there's income tax, and every state you pay tax in some capacity. You can only deduct up to $10,000 of state and local taxes on your federal income tax return. So that's, of course, income tax to the state. It's real estate tax that you pay, sales tax. If you pay anything more than $10,000, you can only deduct $10,000 on your federal income tax return. You used to be able to deduct the whole thing. So if you lived in a high income tax state like California or Illinois or New York, and you paid a large local tax bill, you used to be able to deduct that from your federal tax bill. Well, Trump came in when they changed the tax code in 2017, and he took that away. He said you can only deduct $10,000. He called this his blue state revenge, if you will, because this really only impacts people who live in those high income tax states: California, Illinois, New York. There's others, but almost universally, all of those states are very blue. This is actually a net tax increase by not allowing people who pay a large amount of local tax to be able to deduct all of it. And there's not really a huge incentive for him to remove it. He's not winning those states anyway. It impacts less of the states where there's lower state income tax. And this is kind of a complex part of the tax code. The average person doesn't understand it. What do we know about Trump? He likes simple messaging. So you haven't really heard him talk about this much. I'm aware of it, but I kind of don't think it's going to go away. People aren't going to, except for the very few who pay a lot in tax, which is a very small minority. Except for those people aren't really going to understand or appreciate this tax benefit. He does things most of the time for mass appeal, quite honestly. I don't know if this one's going to go through. Okay. Another one that I think is possible is auto loans, making auto loans fully deductible. The reason I think this is possible is because most people don't itemize on their tax returns. Okay. So the way that our tax code is set up, you can either take a standard deduction, which for a single person is about $13,000, for a married couple is about $26,000. You can take that number, or you can itemize your deductions. For most people, itemized deductions are a combination of really three buckets. It's interest you pay on your mortgage, state and local taxes, we just talked about that, capped at $10,000, and it's charitable contributions. If those three buckets add up to more than your standard deduction for a single person, about 13, for a married couple, about 26. If those three buckets add up to more than your standard deduction, then you get to take an itemized deduction and deduct even more than the standard deduction off of your income. But because the standard deduction is so high, so few people actually itemize. And for the people who are taking out auto loans, which is, let's just say that trends to be people who are more on the low income side rather than the high income side. On the low income side, people are less likely to be itemizing. He can offer auto loans to be fully deductible without actually really moving the needle, because people who are taking auto loans probably won't be able to deduct them anyway. He can say that they're fully deductible, but if people aren't going to be able to take advantage of that credit, who really cares? So again, I think that's another one of these like genius, this is a benefit, but it's not really a benefit kind of things, which he's done quite a lot of. So I think some of these things are going to get put in play. I think, it's probably going to end up being more social fodder than actually practical change, but it is kind of interesting. I did look at, there's another chart on this Tax Foundation site that I find fascinating. And it basically takes this code and it just extrapolates it for the next 10 years. It says, what's going to be the change? Who's going to see the biggest impact? Now, you guys don't have to look it up. I'll just tell you what it says. But it basically says, for people who are in the 95th to 100th, so the very top of the income brackets, they're going to see a net after-tax increase of their income by about 4%. Pretty good, right? And there's a net increase of 2% if you're over the 90th percentile, 1.7% if you're over the 80th percentile, 1.4% if you're over the 60th percentile. 60th percentile. 1.4% if you're over the 80th percentile, 1.4% if you're over the 60th percentile. 1.7% if you're over the 80th percentile, 1.4% if you're over the 60th percentile. 1.4% if you're over the 60th percentile. 1.7% if you're over the 80th percentile. 1.4% if you're over the 60th percentile. 1.7% if you're over the 80th percentile. 1.4% if you're over the 60th percentile. 1.7% if you're over the 80th percentile. 1.4% if you're over the 60th percentile. 1.7% 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 if you're over the 60th percentile. But then between the 40th and 60th percentile, it projects that your income would increase by 0.3%. And then for everybody from the 40th percentile down, all the way to the first percentile, you would actually see a net tax, after-tax income decrease. So quite literally, 40% of the people, if this tax code actually gets put through in the way that he proposed it, 40% of people would see a decrease in their take-home pay. It's insane, right? Like, here's the message. Also, you're going to make less money, but at least you understand it. People are comfortable with things they understand. I don't blame them. That's why they voted for him. People seek simplicity, okay? I don't know what else to tell you. So, simplify your life, vote for Trump. I guess that's what they said. I don't know. Working man's revenge. I don't know anything else. That's all I got for today. See you guys next time.